From the Toronto Star, I'm Adrian Chung, and this matters. We're about 9 months into the pandemic, and millions of us aren't any closer to returning to work in an office anytime soon. Sure, many frontline workers and other employees have returned to in-person jobs, but according to a Stats Canada survey, about 75% of the 3.4 million Canadians that started remote work in March are still working from home, and most of us don't want to go back full-time. A survey from a Canadian HR company, ADP, showed that 60% of people want to work remotely for at least one day of the work week, even after the pandemic is over. So for the foreseeable future, working from home is the reality. But what happens to the physical spaces we're leaving behind? All those offices and retail spaces for thousands of workers and companies, some of them inside big, towering skyscrapers. Those kinds of spaces make up the downtown core of most major cities. Will they all just sit empty? How does that space get used now? To talk about this on the podcast, Matt Elliott, city columnist and frequent contributor to the Toronto Star. We're all working from home, maybe forever. What does that mean for the cities, the buildings, and places we've built up before the pandemic? Matt, it's good to have you back on the podcast.
Excited to be here. Always a good time.
So your job as a journalist covering City Hall, that usually, in the before times, I should say, requires you to be in council chambers, along with the mayor and dozens of city councillors. But in this time, what does your work from home situation look like?
It's a lot of sitting at a desk in front of a computer and typing away at things, occasionally getting up. And especially this time of year, it's trying to get any kind of daylight that I can possibly get.
Yeah.
It's different for sure. I mean, I was always a work from home guy primarily, but the difference between making that choice to stay in the home office for the day versus it being really the only option is definitely a significant one.
Mm-hmm. And I would imagine, not being able to visit council chambers at all at this point, it kind of misses the energy of city politics in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, it's taken some time for staffers to adapt. I know for a lot of reporters, it used to just sort of be that if you worked for a councillor, if you were a councillor or, somebody worked for the mayor, you would just sort of walk down to the press gallery and see if you could get any interest in a story. And now it's a lot more slide into the DMs, that kind of thing. So yeah, it's been a shift for everybody.
The question that many companies and businesses and even the city of Toronto, they're all asking themselves the question of, do we even need physical offices anymore? And at least on the city's properties, what are they learning about what their workforce wants?
Yeah, I found this really fascinating. The city, years ago started a program that ended up being called Modern TO. And that emerged because they looked at the city's portfolio, all the offices they owned, and they realized, because of amalgamation and because government tends to just, you accumulate some clutter, they have 55 office locations across the city, which is a lot. So they thought, we got to find a way to consolidate some of these. We can maybe save some money, maybe use these buildings we own or we lease for other things aside from offices. So they've been working on this for a while, but then the pandemic hit and it really forced the city to, like a lot of businesses, move to work from home for a lot of employees. And it turns out that that's something that's going to stick around for a while, it looks like. The city did a survey over the summer and found that 95% of employees surveyed were super into the idea and want to continue doing it at least a few days a week after the pandemic.
Right. And you wrote about how in this modern TO plan, the city, again, was already trying to cut down on office space. It would save them millions of dollars a year. But now, especially getting back the results of this survey, doesn't that sort of push the city towards cutting down even more? Because there's going to be lots of their employees who don't want to return for at least part of the work week.
Yeah, at least part of the week. I mean, there are people who still, miss the hustle and bustle of the office and the social stuff. But a lot of people seem to be thinking, it would be nice to, 2-3 days a week to keep working at home. So yeah, the city has actually accelerated its plans to get rid of some of this office space. They are working to go from a ratio of about one workstation for every employee down to, so there'll be 2 employees per workstation or close to it. So it's a pretty significant shift, and it will, sort of force their hand at work from home policies after this, because there's just not going to be the space that there was before for everybody to work in the office every day.
And I found the figure that they're going to save on the city, that is $31 million, if they actually reduce all of the properties that they are projected to.
Yeah, it seems huge, but then you think about, 55 properties and the cost of, in some cases renting them, in some cases they own them, but they have to maintain them and buy an office furniture and computers and all this stuff. And there'll still be some of that when it's work from home, but less. So yeah, it's a huge savings. And people talk about, what does this mean for productivity? But you have to factor the savings in, right? Like, even if theoretically some employees aren't as productive as they were in the office when they work at home, and the evidence on that is pretty mixed, you're still saving a bundle, and you'd need to, sort of balance all those factors out.
Similar studies have shown that City of Toronto employees are not alone in this, that there has been a clear shift in white-collar office work, perhaps permanently, that a great majority of workers want to work from home for at least part of the work week, even after the pandemic is over. And so we're thinking about the hundreds of thousands of people who commute into Toronto or any major city who work in, those big offices and office towers. What could now happen to those spaces? Will they just stay empty then?
Yeah, this is the big question. And I wish I had like a really good pat answer for it, but it's like a bit of a mystery at this point, right? Like, we have built this city, the core of the city especially, around the idea that all these people come in every day on the GO trains, or they drive. We have all these commuters who come in, and they work in their offices and they buy stuff in the PATH system, and then they go home. And that sort of sustains this economy in this pretty compact area of Toronto. And, I'm not a doom and gloomer. I'm not saying, it's going to suddenly be a ghost town and there's going to be nobody there. I think a lot of it will come back. But even if it's, 20% fewer people every day, 30% fewer people every day, that has massive impacts on, there's going to be empty space, floors of office buildings. There's going to be businesses that do dry cleaning or, let you do a lunchtime yoga class that won't see the same numbers that they're used to seeing and may not be able to sort of survive in this new economy. So from a policy perspective, it's like, okay, how do we make sure this doesn't end badly? Like, it does to me feel like, okay, we don't have all the answers yet, but it's a foreseeable problem. Like, we have enough data at this point to know, okay, this is a change that is going to happen. So what can governments do to make sure it's a more positive change?
And before we get into that, you raise a really good point about how it's not just the office workers themselves or the businesses that are making these decisions on properties. There is an entire ecosystem, I guess you could call it, of businesses that depend on these offices. You point to the PATH system as a clear example of that. So there are many industries and many businesses that depend on, obviously, all the office workers that usually show up.
Yeah, if you've ever been like in the PATH at rush hour in the morning or the afternoon, I'm not really like a 9 to 5 office worker. So there's been times when I've been trying to walk in like the opposite direction of where all the workers are going. And it's like, you're trying to like swim upstream. It's just this like torrent of people walking towards Union Station, and you're trying to go the other way in the PATH. And then they're, stopping along the way to grab a few things for the train ride home or whatever. So yeah, if we're talking about, that not being quite what it was after the pandemic, yeah, you're really looking at a pretty significant economic impact, because aside from the odd time, those of us who are not this kind of office worker don't usually think, I'll just pop into the PATH and buy something, like it really is pretty amazing economic ecosystem that exists almost entirely for a certain kind of worker.
We'll be right back. You also looked into transit ridership, and obviously we have covered how deeply that has been affected when it comes to the TTC, but you looked also into the GO transit ridership. Of course, that's where a lot of commuters are coming in. What did you find there?
Yeah, it's interesting. TTC ridership is down, transit ridership is down in general because of the pandemic right now. And that makes sense. More people are avoiding it, they're working from home. But there's a huge difference between, where transit ridership is for Go Transit, which would be, primarily the office workers we've been talking about, and where transit ridership is for the TTC, which is a bit more of like a blue collar, everybody rides it sort of a system. So TTC ridership is at about 38% of where it was pre-pandemic. So, it fell almost to nothing and then it's recovered to, 38, 40%, which, it's not great, but it's a recovery. Go ridership, on the other hand, is at just 7.6% of where it was pre-pandemic, according to Metrolink's numbers as of September. So it's like barely anything at this point. And some of the GO train lines, like Richmond Hill, that train line is at 1.5% of where it was pre-pandemic. Even the ones that have held up okay, like Lakeshore lines, are at less than 10% of where they were. So you think about the demographics of GO, and GO will tell you this if you look at how they get advertising, that their clientele is generally people with university degrees, average and higher incomes, often own their own houses instead of rent their own houses. So it's a different demographic. And that demographic is just not in the rush to get back to the commute that people who use the TTC seem to be. And that's probably because, people on the go have the option and more people on the TTC do not.
Right, yeah. And a lot of those Go Transit riders were coming into offices that are closed and will be closed for the foreseeable future. And that kind of gets to what you write about in your column, is essentially what is the future of our cities and our downtown cores and what governments are facing. You make the case that governments themselves, local governments, should be prepared for this. What should they be doing now to prepare then, you think?
Yeah, I think, this gets super nerdy and wonky when you start talking about zoning and stuff like that. But there is the notion that cities have decided that, in the center of them, there's going to be this business district and it's going to have office towers and not much else, and you can see this pattern repeated, not just in Toronto, but in other cities across the world in different ways. And, Toronto actually has done a pretty good job of not having like a big area in the middle of the city that's just like office buildings and gets super dead after 9 p.m. Like we have the Bay Street area that is kind of like that. But, if you go to like Chicago, for example, like they have a pretty significant business area in the Loop and, it's busy during the day and then quickly empties out. So
yeah, you see that in a lot of American cities, that it hollows out basically after 5 p.m.
Exactly. So I think in some ways, Toronto is maybe in a better position than some of those cities to deal with this, but there still needs to be this idea that like, okay, we don't necessarily need to be thinking that these buildings are office towers and only office towers, right? Like maybe there's a way where you can look at some of these spaces, with the idea that they're going to be, if not empty, but have unused areas in them and think, okay, instead of this being home to a bank or whatever, is there a institutional use like a university? Is there a community use? Or even, is there possibility of changing the stuff into housing? The city has an affordable housing crisis and will have an affordable housing crisis after the pandemic. And if we have empty real estate or underused real estate, like why not look at that as an option for affordable housing? The location would be pretty darn good.
Right. That this is maybe even a chance for reinvention of how we use our spaces in these massive towers in the middle of the city.
Yeah, exactly. And like there's a big reason to push this kind of thing. Like I am worried because, we are dealing with this pandemic and it sucks and it's a crisis. But there's another crisis that is also over us, hovering around like a specter at all times, and that's climate change. And climate change is not going to be helped if people decide, you know what, I'm going to move out to the city and buy 2 cars for me and my partner. If that is, a lasting trend that comes from this, that is going to have some pretty significant environmental impacts. So what I'd like to see, is more of a push for like, how can we continue to incentivize like living in a more compact downtown area where you can walk to get what you need. And, even if you are working from home a couple days a week, you can still walk to work or cycle or take transit on the days when you do need to go into the office.
You cover city council every day. Have you seen any city councilors or city hall start to take a look at this, considering, again, all of these surveys and this data that shows us a lot of these office workers, at least in the short term, potentially in the long term, they're not coming back?
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons I wrote the column, because, councillors and the mayor did get this report about Modern TO, their own office consolidation plan, which talked about, the shift to work from home. And they seem very excited about the cost savings and the potential to maybe shed some of this real estate or do something else with some of this real estate that they own or lease. But I'm not entirely sure that it's totally, twigged in their minds yet that this is not just a City Hall thing or a City of Toronto thing. Like, the City of Toronto has to be more public about its plans for office consolidation. But the reason I wrote the column is I was thinking, if the city is doing this and the city is not exactly at the cutting edge of things all the time, it stands to reason that, some of our biggest businesses downtown are making the same type of shift and thinking a lot about it right now. So I haven't seen a lot of realization yet that this is something that the city needs to be thinking about policy-wise, but I'm hoping that, with a little push here and there, we can get there, and it won't be something, in like 2 or 3 years when we're going to see this really take hold and it's like, oh no, what are we going to do about this? It's better to be prepared now.
Yeah, hopefully it's not kicking the can down the road for another day, and it's an issue that they need to start thinking about now. Matt, thank you so much for your reporting and for joining us on the podcast.
Oh, happy to do it anytime.
And that is Matt Elliott, who covers and writes about the goings-on at Toronto City Hall. He's a frequent city columnist for the Toronto Star. That's it for today. Thanks for listening. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Adrian Chung, Saba Aitazaz, and Raju Mudhar. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattinen, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.